Well, good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from the graduate school here at Western Kentucky University. Welcome to the third GRADLEARN series. The GRADLEARN is a new initiative that we started in last fall that provides information about evidence-based practices related to graduate education. Today, we have the privilege and opportunity to listen to Dr. John Augusto from Georgia State University regarding holistic admission practices. This is a joint venture with ETS, and now I kindly ask Ms. Catherine Schultz, who is Director of Academic Partnerships at ETS, to introduce Dr. John Augusto and moderate this GRADLEARN series. Ms. Schultz?
Thank you, Dr. Kudali. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the webinar here today on holistic admissions, recruiting and admitting diverse students. As Dr. Kudali mentioned, I'm Catherine Schultz and I am the Director of Academic Partnerships at ETS and really your main point of contact for all things ETS, ranging from holistic admissions to the GRE and TOEFL programs, as well as other ETS related services. So feel free to reach out. We are so glad that you've joined us here today, but just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. We have muted the lines to cut out the background noise, but we definitely do want to hear from you. So as questions arise as we go through the presentation, please log your questions into the chat and I will be monitoring that as John goes through the presentation. And then we hope to get to those questions at the end of the session for the Q&A portion. If we happen to not be able to get through questions, we'll follow up with you directly. And also, we are recording the session today and feel free to share with your colleagues after today. I'll also send copies of the slides that John goes through today. Now on to our speaker, Dr. John Augusto. John currently works as the Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives in the College of Arts and Sciences at Georgia State University. In this role, he oversees the implementation of the college to career efforts within the college, as well as community and industry engagement. Previously, he was at the University of Kansas, where he provided key leadership in graduate education. We are very honored and proud to have John as one of our ETS graduate education advisors, and so excited that he is here with us today. Please, everybody, welcome Dr. John Augusto. John?
Thanks, Catherine. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate the warm welcome. I'm grateful for everyone being here today. I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have. It is a somewhat sunny day here in Atlanta, Georgia. I hope it's sunny and Bowling Green. But I think we got a really great afternoon packed full of lots of information. I love the opening remarks about evidence-based practices because I firmly believe in that. I'm going to give you a lot of evidence today about holistic admissions. And to get started, let's just dive right in. So today's session, I want to talk a little bit about ETS's engagement with the graduate education community. I want to make sure folks are kind of up to speed about where that is. I want to talk a little bit about the search for evidence when we start to put together our application portfolios, what that evidence looks like, and really start to kind of document and demonstrate that in a meaningful way. We definitely want to make sure we address some of the key challenges that we're facing in graduate admissions. We're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about the holistic admissions process. And of course, we want to mention the use of the GRE scores, both its benefits and its limitations. So I think it's really important to spend a minute and talk about ETS. ETS is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance quality and equity in education with over 70 years experience in educational research. I know I got involved with an education advisor with my 20 years of working with the GRE, of working with ETS, of working with TOEFL, because I was really impressed with the level of professionalism, the level of research that goes on. It's an organization that administers and scores 50 million tests annually in 180 countries and puts significant investment into researching solutions that are focused on improving educational outcomes for all. So it was mentioned that I'm a graduate education advisor. Well, what is that? What are we doing here? So in 2019, ETS created the Office of Graduate Education Engagement, and it includes 5 key strategic advisors with years of boots on the ground experiences in graduate education. As was mentioned, I'm at Georgia State right now as an associate dean. Before that, I was at the University of Kansas for 25 years, working in graduate education, working in research administration. We also have an academic partnership team, of which Catherine's part of, to really understand and support the challenges that work together, along with that academic support team that's been there for a number of years, providing training and support and answering questions about the GRE tests and services. So we're visiting campus nationwide, doing a lot of these Zoom calls, if you will, to learn from you all about what you're doing with graduate admissions practice, but also to share with you the information that we've collected about holistic admissions so that we can explore together what's the future of graduate admissions going to look like? What are the key issues we need to look at? And look at it not just from the admissions, but from the entire graduate student life cycle. So like I said, I'm delighted to be working with these amazing colleagues that are listed here. Terry Ackerman's a internationally recognized scholar in the field of education measurement. Maureen Garasso and Steve Matson, as well as Carlos, are all former deans like me, former grad deans. We sat and had conversations with graduate faculties on our campus. We sat and had conversations with graduate faculty on other campuses as well, talking about what are the key issues that they're facing. So I gave you a little bit of overview of kind of who and what. I want to spend a little time talking about evidence and talk about how we collect evidence for our application portfolios. But before we do that, I want to start with a poll. So I've got a poll question here. Catherine, can you pop up the poll for us? The poll question says, what's the currently most important to your graduate program? And you get one choice. So what's the clear most important thing in your program? I'll give everybody a few seconds. We'll get those responses in and we'll take a look. Give everybody a few more seconds. All right, we're going to end the poll and see what we came up with. So clearly, there's a real big push to get the number of applicants increased in the graduate programs. And that's pretty common. We see that a lot, both on the domestic side and international when we're talking with different universities. Funding is always an issue that we're trying to address in very specific ways. Trying to fund, we're just having a conversation today with my colleagues here at Georgia State about a particular program and how to create a funding program that's going to work for both our master's and doctoral students. Increasing diversity and completion rates always on top of the mind for folks who work with graduate students, making sure that our graduate applicant pool is diverse. When we yield those students and we bring them onto our campus, that we have a diversity focus there as well. And of course, getting those students through our program, vitally key and important as well. So all key questions I think that you're thinking about, that your colleagues are thinking about on other campuses as well. All right. We got our next question. Stop sharing. All right, here we go. Our next poll, which is, have you mapped the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to successfully navigate your graduate program onto each element of your holistic admissions portfolio? So what do you require in that portfolio? What are the elements? And how do they map to the knowledge, skills, and abilities so that your students can successfully navigate their program? Give everybody a few minutes to a few more seconds to work on that. All right. We're going to end the poll and share the results. So this is not atypical from a lot of the graduate programs I talk with, a lot of the universities I speak with in terms of the mapping process. It's like some of you have taken that step. My hope is that by the end of today's session, you all go back to your colleagues in your graduate programs and sit and have a conversation about what are you asking for in your admissions portfolio and what evidence does that bring forward into a better understanding of how that student's going to be successful in navigating your graduate program. So when I talk about searching for desired evidence, I think there's some real key components that we do this mapping process to really think about. One is, how are you recognizing an applicant's cognitive skills? Typically that's done in things like the classes they've taken, the GRE, sometimes looking at the GRE quantitative scores in terms of their quantitative thinking, academic background, do they have the necessary coursework from a particular university? Their personal attributes, grit, self-determination. These are things that we're looking for in our future graduate students. We want to make sure we can talk about that as part of the graduate admissions process. Do they have a good fit with our program in terms of the program's goals, its mission? Is there a good fit between what they're interested in pursuing and what we're offering in our graduate program? Can we tap into our applicants' interests, their passions? Maybe that's done through the letters of recommendation. Maybe that's done through their own statement. And then of course that work experience that for a lot of programs can be very vital in showing the necessary skills that's going to make them successful in working through the difficulties that come with pursuing a graduate degree. There it goes. So where is that evidence we're looking for? So when we start to look at things like the undergraduate transcript, the earned GPA, we look at things like the GRE scores, personal statement, or maybe a statement of purpose, letters of recommendation, resumes, and research experience and interviews. And we start to map those on top of the cognitive skills. So when we're looking at cognitive skills, we can look at things like the GRE scores. We can look at things like the courses that they earned. We look at things like work experience. What are we looking at? Well, we can find that work experience maybe in a personal statement, that maybe they did some volunteer work there, or their statement of purpose. They were a research assistant, an undergrad research assistant, and that got them interested in doing research for graduate study. Or maybe it talks about the fit with the program. Maybe one of the letters comes from a former alumni of your program and says, this is a really great student, this is why they fit into this program. All places where we can find evidence about those key things that we're looking for, things like cognitive skills, personal attributes, and fit with program. So when we're out talking with colleagues across the United States, and even in Canada, here's some of the things we're hearing about in terms of some of the challenges that we're faced with in terms of graduate admissions. We want to recruit and admit underrepresented students, but we can't get enough of them in the pool, into our pool of applicants. There's not really a lot of training for faculty, for folks involved with graduate admission in terms of how to evaluate applicants. Course funding is always an issue. We're always looking for ways to make sure we maximize our funding so we can fund the students that we need for our graduate program. Additional challenges are things like, the biases that we bring to the graduate admissions process, both conscious and unconscious, and how are we addressing those? How do we evaluate a lot of campuses, a lot of undergrad programs that went to a pass-fail option? How do we evaluate pass-fail in our review of that student's application? Of course, COVID has really changed the way we've done things. And coming out of COVID, hopefully, what practices are we going to keep in place? What practices are we going to continue to change and evolve based on what we learned during that COVID period? All of these things and many more are challenges that graduate programs are facing when they're working in the space of graduate admissions. And that's even why I think even more so coming out of COVID, holistic admissions process really allows you to maximize diversity, really allows you to really take a hard look at your processes while you're asking those questions and take a really good look at the ways in which you're admitting your students. So ETS has been involved with holistic admissions for a couple of years now. They went back and did campus interviews with various colleagues across, whoops, my screen went there. There it goes. They did campus interviews with 71 different individuals, deans and faculties from the following disciplines, to really start to look at what's the literature, what's the promising practices around holistic admissions, and really start to build a kind of a database of materials that they could put together to really feed into a report that was written from for the Council of Grad Schools on holistic review and graduate admissions, and really created the kind of launched the holistic admissions.org website that's listed here on the slide here as well. So when we start thinking about holistic admissions and holistic process, what are we talking about in terms of the benefits? I think it's the opportunity to gain a clearer picture of an applicant's potential fit, applicants that are going to be successful in your program, and to give a fair review for all applicants. And I really like this quote by Mark Smith, where he says, holistic review, really understanding the unconscious biases and being aware of the inequities in access to opportunities. And we think that's really important to look at, because we know, for example, just on studies that ETS has done, as well as studies from others, really shows the social economic advantages extend to virtually all parts of the admissions process. For example, the undergrad institution attended, private versus public, is a good example of that. Undergraduate grades, we know that students who come from a lower social economic status, a lower SES, they tend to work more, and working either on campus or off, the more hours you work has an impact on the grades. Who writes letters of recommendation? If I'm a student and I don't have time to volunteer undergraduate research, that means I may not get to know that faculty member quite as well, which will impact my letter of recommendation. GRE scores, that linkage between social economic advantages and GRE scores has been well documented, as well as admissions essays. These are all things that we know we have to keep in mind when we're building our graduate admissions process. But that we need to make sure that we understand that results show that essays have a strong correlation to reported household incomes than SAT scores. We know that there's some bias there. We've got to make sure that we understand it. And this Stanford study does a really good job, and we'll provide you this link afterwards so you can go in and look at that. It really provides you a really strong understanding of what that looks like. But it's really important that we all know we have to make decisions, and we have to make decisions based on the data, but you have to understand how that social economic status impacts the application criteria we're using to evaluate our applicants. So what is holistic admissions? Give us a kind of a definition. I think you have to think about what criteria are considered, which we started to do. I think we need to think about who's considering that criteria. I think we ought to think about in terms of in what order is the criteria being considered, and how the criteria is weighted based on the goals of the program. And we'll talk more about that as well. Holistic practices can be embedded in each step of the process that you see listed here: preparing the admissions process, collecting the information, reviewing applicant files, selecting applicants, and evaluating your admissions process. Again, evidence-based, so we want to make sure that we're evaluating the evidence in our admissions process. So the first step is preparing for the admissions process. It's setting the goals and the principles, structuring the process to achieve those goals, and considering the committee composition and training. We know that when we do a holistic evaluation, it's a truer sense of that applicant and what he or she wants to do with your graduate program. Great quote here by Janet Rutledge. So this is the one part I think a lot of admissions committees at the program level kind of, they just overstep. They don't think about what does success look like in our graduate admissions process. What are the principles we're going to use to make sure that we achieve our goals, and just have a conversation about getting started with a process, getting started with guiding principles that informs every step of the process. Fortunately, ETS has done a really great job of connecting graduate admissions practices with goals. the study you see studied here really gives you a chance to kind of sit down as a graduate program or even as a school and talk about what admission practices we're going to foster in our graduate admissions process, so that what practices we hope to foster so we can have a holistic review process. We have our next question. Catherine, take it away. This question is there any formal training for new people added to the admissions committee prior to admissions deliberations? You pop in your response there. And as people are popping in their response, I will remind folks that as questions come up, please put them in the chat. We will have plenty of time at the end to address your questions. I'm looking forward to the Q&A section of today's session. Give everybody a few more seconds. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So it looks like the majority of folks don't allow or don't provide any type of formal training. And that's pretty typical when I'm talking to different universities, that there's not really a formal training process. When we start talking about beginning admissions deliberations, everyone just kind of says, you know, here's the files, here's where they're located, good luck. And so we want to really talk about what that might look like. Okay, poll 3. So let's talk about preparing for the admissions process. I think one of the things we want to make sure we think about is who's on the committee and what training can we provide. So here's a couple of things to think about. One is whether there's a balance of influence among team members. I remember working with one admissions committee when I was at the University of Kansas, and it was primarily full professors, one non-tenure track faculty member, and one assistant professor. And clearly there was an imbalance of influence because the full professors felt like they could run the show, they had the voice of their colleagues, and they pretty much could bully around the other two committee members. We want to make sure that we try to keep some type of balance of influence involved with that. We want to make sure that there's a variety of perspectives and experiences as well. And we can talk about like whether some programs want to use students in that, with some programs want to use non-tenure track faculty versus tenure track faculty. There's different mixes for different ways, and we can get into that in the Q&A. I think it's really important that faculty become less familiar with undergraduate schools. I always tell this story when I give the session. When I was at the University of Kansas, we had a really strong chemistry program, and we had a strong school of pharmacy that had medicinal chemistry and pharmaceutical chemistry. And those programs attracted applicants from all over the world. But we started to see an increase in the number of applicants from Puerto Rico. But quite frankly, we knew very little about Puerto Rican applicants. So I cobbled together some money from a couple of deans for my own resources, and I took 4 faculty members, including myself, down to Puerto Rico. Now, I know what you're thinking. Puerto Rico, great. But actually, we spent 5 days there. We visited 4 campuses. We talked to numerous faculty members, numerous students, and we sat and had a conversation about what does a chemistry undergrad at this campus look like? What are the faculty thinking about it? What are the students thinking about it? What do the labs look like? Because our faculty in those programs did not know enough about those programs. Now, what we saw was this. We didn't go back every year, but we had applicants from there every year after that. And we saw a strong, steady increase in the number of applicants because we knew those programs now. We knew those campuses. So while you may not be able to fly a group of faculty to Puerto Rico or to Atlanta, Georgia, but make sure that they get familiar with kind of less known schools, less familiar schools as part of this process. And that they work with undergraduate students from underrepresented groups. It's really important that we often look at the ways in which underrepresented students come into the graduate admissions process. There is plenty of opportunity to do implicit or unconscious bias training, both on the campus wide. There's also some really great programs that are out there as well. If your campus is interested in doing that, I think we've even got some really great resources that Cornell put together. Cornell's graduate school put together a really excellent resource, and it's on the holisticadmissions.org website about resources around implicit bias. Just taking the time to recognize it and to name it is a good first place to start. So you've done your training, you've had your conversations, you put you compose your committees, and now it's time to do the work, right? You're going to collect the information. You're going to determine what evidence needs to be collected. You're going to ensure that your application explicitly requests the questions that you want to get answered, and you collect comparable information from all the applicants. I love this quote by Maureen, my colleague. She says, using GRE scores is essential to having a full understanding of the potential of each applicant. It's a great quote, and it really talks about that complete assessment of each applicant. So when we start putting the evidence together, putting that mapping I was showing you earlier, we're going to look at things like personal statements, statement of purpose, a resume. We're going to talk about the undergrad GPA, the major GPA. We're going to look at the transcript as a whole. We're going to look at the undergrad institution as well. We're going to look at standardized assessments like the GRE test score. And we're going to talk about the personal attributes documentation, that personal statement or that letter of recommendation. And there's a lot to kind of go through here and really start to understand the evidence of what it means. And so ETS has done a great job of really providing kind of a really hands-on understanding the purpose, the pros and cons of application criteria. A really great document on the holisticadmissions.org website that you can give to your colleagues and say, read this before we review applicants, so they can really start to understand. Here's a great example of that. So when I was at the University of Kansas, we had a lot of graduate programs, and even here and now at Georgia State, faculty will say, if a student does undergraduate research, and they do that well, they're going to do well in our graduate program. And I don't disagree with that. I think undergraduate research is an amazing experience. Part of my time at Kansas, I was the founding director for our Center for Undergraduate Research. But here's what I can tell you from my own working knowledge, as well as what's been studied, is that students from lower SES, students who are underrepresented minorities, tend to not do undergraduate research. So you really need to think about the role of undergraduate research when you look at your graduate program. This does a really good job looking at pros and cons for each part of that criteria and really opens people's eyes to what exactly we're asking for and what exactly we're looking for when we do our admissions process. Because what it comes down to is we're really looking at the purpose, the benefits, the drawbacks, and how to mitigate those drawbacks in each part of our admission cycle. Now, I'm going to mention one specific one here, and I've had a lot of experiences, I'm sure folks on the call have today as well, with personal statements. It really gets at that student's passion, their personality, their potential. I used to tell my students at Kansas, and I tell my students here at Georgia State, this personal statement speaks for you when you're not in the room. It can really, really help your application process. It gives a humanizing kind of objective, quantifiable information, because it's a student story you're hearing now. Unique backgrounds, perspectives, all those things kind of come into play. And it really starts to think about, like, is this student really suitable for our graduate program? What's their intent? Really gets at those key issues that we're trying to get at when we look at our graduate admissions process. There are some drawbacks to the personal statement. It's dependent on the reviewer's factors. Some reviewers are looking for certain things. Some reviewers are looking for other things. There is subject to an explicitness of the instructions. In other words, the good questions you ask, you get good answers. If you don't have good answers or good questions in your personal statement, you might not get the answers you're looking for. And there's ways in which we can mitigate some of those drawbacks, like having multiple reviewers, like using a descriptive rubric. But this is kind of the essence of what I think holistic admissions is trying to draw into. Looking at the purpose, the benefits, any type of drawbacks we see in our criteria, and how to mitigate those drawbacks. So now we've got our process, we've got our materials, and now we're ready to review. We're diving in. So we got a holistic review process that we're going to adopt. We're going to look at multiple criteria, and we're going to think about, do we need an alternative or alternate process to really get a holistic review of our applicants. I love Michael's quote here. It says, holistic process that is inclusive in both objective and subjective measures is inherently fair and more respectful to all applicants, and it helps the programs meet their needs. Great quote. I think it's really, really important that we have both objective and subjective measures. So again, one of the things we want to think about is all the alternative processes that we could look at to maybe mitigate some bias that we have in our admissions process. So what we're trying to do is avoid what's called the framing bias. And the best way to describe framing bias is to think about it from my point of view. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm in downtown Atlanta. Beautiful day in Atlanta. And there are some other extremely well-known universities in Atlanta besides Georgia State University, Georgia Tech and Emory. And I hear it all the time from our faculty. Oh, that person's a Georgia Tech student. They're fine. It's like they've already framed up the fact that that person's got that degree as much better than any other school, possible school, because they've created a framing bias around that institution. So some of the things to think about are considering withholding the undergrad GPA and the GRE scores until we review personal statements or sometimes Zoom interviews are done. Those are done first before we look at the more quantitative measures like undergrad GPA or GRE scores. We want to make sure that regardless, that all participants review the application materials in the same order and completely independent. When I was at Kansas, I had to deal with a couple of rogue faculty members who decided it would be a good idea to create a power block for their admissions committee, and they reviewed them together and they kind of voted together. And we kind of found that out afterwards, and we said, that's not really going to be fair to all the applicants if you're kind of doing that in practice. And so we had to kind of shut that down in a very quiet but very succinct way to make sure that each applicant got reviewed independently from each admissions committee. I think there's some bias in terms of interviewing and letters of recommendation, who writes letters of recommendation, for example. And the Georgetown University School of Medicine has a great study that's on the holisticadmissions.org website that really gives you some really in-depth information about how to look at unconscious bias, especially around interviewing and especially around letters of recommendation, which I think is really important. So we've done the hard work, and now we're ready to select our applicants. We've got our pools. We're looking at them hard. We're using our holistic lens. We're going to balance our quantitative and qualitative measures. We're going to consider the composition of the class as a whole, not just as individuals as well. And we're going to use a rubric so that we can ensure consistency. This is a great quote from Joanne. She says, information about applicants' critical thinking skills provided through the GRE scores serves as the science. And that's important, but also information about personal attributes and passions found in personal statements and recommendations serves as the art, because graduate admissions is both an art and a science. So we've got poll question number 4. Catherine, can you pull it up, please?
Coming at you.
So do you have meetings prior to the admissions deliberations to discuss and decide different pieces of the admissions portfolio will be weighted? Give everybody a few more seconds to answer that question. And we're going to end the poll here and share results. So it looks like you're meeting before admission decisions. That's good to talk about and decide how to weight the different parts of the admissions portfolio. I think that's really, really important to get those addressed. The next section, you're ready to select your applicants. You're ready to have that conversation. And if you don't remember anything from today's session, which I hope you remember a few things, but if you don't remember anything, remember this: use a rubric. A rubric is a great way to ensure that you really align the reviewer's evaluation of the applicants with the program goals. A rubric gives you opportunities to get points on things that the program values and fewer points that the program values less. And it's recommended actions. Again, rubrics don't admit students. Rubrics give that guided conversation that the admissions committee can have in order to discuss and deliberate and decide on who gets admitted to the graduate program. We've got a fantastic article that I want to make sure folks know about. Using a holistic admissions scorecard, a rubric for fair and consistent application review. Again, it's on the holisticadmissions.org website. Really gives folks a chance to kind of dive in. But this is what I hear from a lot of faculty. I don't have any experience in building a rubric. Hold that thought 1 second. We got our next poll question. Poll question number 5. Catherine, take it away. So this poll question says, which, if any, of the skills and abilities are important for students to do well in their program? And you can mark all, it's a multiple choice question. You can mark all the above, or you can pick the ones that you think best represent your graduate program. Give everybody a minute to answer those. A few more seconds. All right, let's share the results. A little bigger. So it looks like critical thinking is high up on folks' list, all the above. There isn't a trick question, but sometimes there is a tricky question. And the reason why we put this poll question in is because if you look at things like critical thinking, reading comprehension, data analysis, understanding information from charts, tables, and graphs, these are all the types of things that the GRE measures. And so I want to make sure we spend a few minutes talking about the importance of the GRE, because we think that's going to be really important, although we missed that slide. So let's jump right into rubric building. Hang on a second. I think oh, we're missing this. Oh, look at that. We're missing the slide. That's all right. We're going to jump right into rubrics because rubrics are great, important stuff. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of faculty do not have experience with rubrics. They just feel like, oh, you know, I don't really understand how to build them. It's a really, really simple, but yet can be a difficult conversation to have, because what it says is these are the things we value. So as an example, I've got a graduate program here. It's a PhD program, and they value research. They value students who come in with good quantitative skills, and they value students who have strong GPAs. So it's a science field, to kind of give you some context there. So on the far left, you see things like undergraduate research. They give it a maximum of 5 points, and the point value has a variance. So like from 3 points, you get 1 year of undergraduate research experience or internship research, you get 3 points. If you've just got the 1 year of undergraduate research, you get 2 points. If you got less than a year, you get 0 points, and you get 1 point for extra publications or posters. So if you did undergraduate research for a year and you did a poster competition, you could get 4 points. So really important though, max is the 5. So you see that's what they're going to value there. Letters of recommendation, work experience, undergrad curriculum, and then the GPA, all different point values because they're putting value on those components. On the right side, you see things like the personal statement. And they've got a little rubric score there for that suggests a strong fit, suggests good fit, or an unclear fit. And that's a -1 for a poor fit. Oh. Boy, the gremlins are in my PowerPoint today. Here we go. So then the GRE breaks down because we never add the scores, the three parts of the GRE. Again, this program values quantitative and analytical. So they have the max there is 2, verbal reasoning is 1. The total scores made for each applicant, and that's a recommendation that the committee can look at and again, discuss, deliberate, and decide on that particular applicant moving forward based on the collective conversation that they've had using the rubric in that admissions review process. Again, we want to make sure that we have an evidence-based approach to our graduate admissions. It's really important that we evaluate our admissions process, because I think a lot of times, and I've been guilty of this as well, sitting on admissions committees, we go in, we deliberate, we read the files, or looking on, talking and discussing, and then we decide this is the pool of students we're going to wait list, the pool of students we're going to admit, these are the pool of students we're going to deny. Our work is done. Not quite. We want to make sure that we evaluate the outcomes against our inputs. We want to make sure that we gain, insight. One of the things that I have done with graduate programs is we have done interviews, and we've talked with students about like what was their admissions process like. Sometimes we did it with survey, a quick 5-question survey. Sometimes we would do interviews once they got on campus, just getting to get some more information, some more data to evaluate our process. And then we want to make sure we understand why our students are dropping out. Once they admit and matriculate to our program, we want to make sure we have got an understanding of why our students aren't successfully completing the program. Because, and Carlos, I love this quote from Carlos, he says, completion is more often caused by what happens after enrollment, and programs and institutions can influence that outcome by developing strong mentoring programs and a culture of inclusion. We know things like what happens to students once they're admitted in terms of their personal life, in terms of life choices, life changes that goes on. Those have impact on the student's ability to complete the graduate degree. So when we look at how to evaluate our admissions process, we want to make sure that we're measuring outcomes. So make sure that we look for patterns that help define the admissions practices. If the goals aren't being met, maybe we think about changing our strategies in terms of recruiting. There's a great model that looks at kind of decoupling the GRE from race, ethnicity, and gender. Again, evidence-based, more data, more studies done to really look at that question in more in-depth. It's on the holisticadmissions.org website. Catherine can get you a copy of that model to really kind of get you thinking about how that might look for you. And again, for those programs that have a large enough sample size, ETS is willing to help out and determine which components are predicting student success, however your program wants to define what success looks like. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't have a little bit of a mention at least, or at least a kind of a thinking idea about why students drop out. And it's really important that we understand what are our pain points when it comes to student progression, what are our pain points in terms of student program retention rates. We know that conducting exit surveys and interviews to make sure that at the program level, we're trying to figure out ways in which that our students can make sure that they're successful. Like I said, there are some things that are out of control of the program, but we want to make sure for the things that are in control of the program that we want to make sure we're understanding what that looks like. And I think it's really important to say this because I've seen this misquoted a lot. GRE scores cannot predict which students will drop out due to life circumstances. They're helpful in determining who has the reasoning, who has the critical thinking, and the writing skills needed for graduate level work, and who might struggle in that area. There's a great study on the holisticadmissions.org website about retention for graduate programs. We can get you a copy of it, give it to your colleagues, read it yourself, give us your feedback on it, because we know this is a key issue for many programs now and will be in the future. So in a nutshell, I've given you kind of a very fast and furious overview of holistic admissions best practices, starting with preparing for the process, collecting information, reviewing applicants' files, selecting your applicants, and evaluating the process. Here's a couple key reminders. Number one is that while we are recording this, and you can go back and watch this, be sure and use the downloadable information from the holisticadmissions.org website that's referenced here to really help shape and mold your admissions practices, and make sure you share it with your colleagues. We want to make sure the information's out there so people are making the best decisions about their admissions process. And to help with that, we've created a digital guide on the Holistic Admissions site that goes through many of the aspects that I've talked about today in terms of preparing the admissions process, reviewing the files, evaluating the process. It's in a PDF that's available for you to use with your colleagues, to have that conversation about what holistic admissions could look like for your graduate program or for your school or college. Like I said, I do want to mention the GRE. So let's go to our poll, which is our 6th question, which is, which the following best characterizes your program's approach to using the GRE test score? If the GRE is optional, I am curious, because I asked this question for those campuses that are optional. What's the program's plan to compare students who have submitted GRE scores versus those who don't? And if you're one of those programs and you feel like answering, please put your answer in the chat. Give everybody about a minute to answer those questions. All right, let's share the results. Number of the programs do not require the GRE. We can talk about the test optional question in the chat and in the Q&A if you like. Some have suspended, looks like, and some will continue to require it. So that's pretty on par with a lot of the universities that I'm speaking with about whether they're using the GRE or not using the GRE. Again, we just want to make sure we get that information so we can collect it, so we can better have that conversation about what that looks like, not only for your graduate programs at Western Kentucky, but just in general in terms of graduate education, keeping that conversation going forward. So thank you for that. So like I said, I want to spend a little time talking about the GRE and the benefits of using the GRE score. I think it really enables us to compare applicants of different backgrounds completely fairly. Programs that can access the applicants' actual essays can do so through the data manager. We can talk about some of the issues that we have with the GRE, some of the drawbacks as well, because I'm sure you have questions about that. But it really kind of balances out the subjective information. You know, we can talk about the GPAs, for example, and we'll talk about those and other things, but it's really important that we also look at what are the limitations when we talk about the GRE scores. So test scores sometimes can't offer insight to qualities or factors that predict academic or career success. And certainly no one measure, as we've said before, can really measure a person's potential. But when programs misuse GRE scores by using cutoff scores, they are disadvantaging some students. And it's the use of the cutoff score that we have issue with. And that's why I got involved with this effort, is to make sure we understand that it's the use of the cutoff score that's disadvantaging those students. On average, members of different groups perform differently on the test, which can be addressed through holistic review. Oops. So remember earlier we were talking about GPA and those students who go to undergrad at a public school, and those who go to a private school. And this is from gradeinflation.com. It's a great study that shows that really, if you look at all parts of the application process, educational opportunities and life circumstances can have a substantial influence on the components of applicants. Who writes letters of recommendation? The reputation of an undergrad institution, we've talked about that. Personal statements, undergrad GPA. If you look at undergrad GPA, public schools versus private schools, you see that the private schools GPA has gone up quite a bit in the last 30 years compared to public schools. started out higher and has continued to rise higher. Only the GRE test scores are backed by ongoing research, are overseen by a group of peers of graduate faculty members, meets and in many cases exceeds in the psychometric standards, and really has a process to ensure it's as free from bias as possible. We've got some great studies there to cite if you want more information about that. There's been an exciting new study came out in 2019 from the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center that looked at the use of GRE scores in the holistic review. It says it's the practice of using cutoff scores, not the GRE tests, that disproportionately affects doctoral applicants from underrepresented groups. And admissions committees can mitigate GRE score variances between different demographic groups. And the study also found that a multi-tiered holistic application review process increases the diversity applicant pool without increasing the workload of the admissions committee. The link to the reports there, you will have this as part of the takeaway materials. The report also gives a really strong blueprint for institutions or graduate programs that want to implement a data-driven approach to assess applications that uses GRE as a part of the process. We know diversity is important. You guys have told us that in today's session. We've heard that from your colleagues across the United States. ETS has done a really nice job of collecting resources about how to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a program level, from a school level. Gives some good example there of different graduate programs and what they're doing, or different universities and what they're doing to diversify graduate education. We want to be part of this conversation going forward because we know how important it is. We also know that there are questions out there that sometimes don't get answered, and there are sometimes myths out there that need to be busted. So we've created this little website called Common Myths About Using the GRE that you can share with your colleagues. There's also a PDF out there that talks about the benefits on there on the holisticadmissions.org website to give you that information that you need when you're talking with your admissions committees, when you're talking with your colleagues about the myths about using the GRE. I want to make sure you know about some of the efforts going underway, how we're looking at, for example, the use of the GRE fee reduction program that is available to students like, for example, in the McNair Scholars Program, the free GRE test prep that's out there, and that Fairness 360 shares an overview of the 19 ways in which ETS lives out the commitments to each of these key areas when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, all this information is available for you to use as part of this. So I want to make sure we have time for our questions and answers. We're going to share with you the slides of the recording. Again, it's really important. That's why I got involved with this work. Talk to your faculty members about admissions practices. So many times we just kind of skip over that part. So many times we're afraid to have that conversation. You know, just say, hey, I went to this webinar. This guy gave me this stuff. I think you might find it interesting, right? So really have that conversation there. Consider developing and sharing your admissions rubric. You know, if you've got an admissions rubric, we would love to see it. So make sure you get in contact with Catherine and I about that. And if you've got any particular pain points that we can help with through our promising practices we've collected from other institutions, please, please, please let us know. I've mentioned this a couple of times already. The holisticadmissions.org website's there. There's information about the GRE. My email's there, Catherine's email's there to really give you the information you need on how best to move forward. I know we've got some questions coming in, so I'm delighted to say the PowerPoint's done and it's time for the Q&A. Catherine.
Yes, we just had a question come in from Carl Dick. The graph depicting grade inflation over time is profound. Are there a few primary factors that are understood to have caused this inflation? And he further comments that it seems to me it would be good for graduate admissions criteria to avoid measures that would serve to reward grade inflation.
So here's what I know from my practice in graduate admissions, and here's what I know from national studies when we look at grade inflation. One area, like I mentioned in the stat, it's gradeinflation.com, is looking at privates versus publics, and who goes to a private university for their undergrad degree and who goes to a public university for an undergrad degree. Primarily, you know, overall, students from a lower SES, a lower social economic status, tend to go to public universities, right? And there's been some studies done around the pressure at private universities to ensure that students graduate with high GPAs. It's the old saying of, if I'm going to pay $100,000 for an undergrad degree, which in some cases is pretty easy to do at private universities. In some cases, if you're going to pay that much for an undergrad degree, you want to make sure that there's some value to it, some worth to it. It's not been like an obvious thing that universities have done. It's been a slow creeping process over many years. So I think it's really important that you think about, okay, when we're doing this review, if we say, well, this is a private university, it must be better, make sure you really have a conversation about why you think that's the case. And one of the great ways to do that is to really have as an admissions committee, when you're off cycle, when you're not reviewing files, pull together 2 or 3 conversations with 2 or 3 big campuses that you get feeder programs from. So maybe you get 10 applicants a year from a school that's maybe 30 miles away. Pull up a Zoom call and say, can we have a conversation with 2 or 3 of your colleagues to talk about what your undergrad degree is like, what courses you take, what sequencing courses, and come up with a set of 5 or 6 questions, have an hour-long conversation, and begin to inform your practice by really having an understanding of what the other institution looks like. I'll give you a great example of this. We have a graduate program here at Georgia State, and that program gets a number of applicants from another school in the state of Georgia, which is wonderful. The faculty don't know each other. The students talk about the faculty like they do know each other, even though they don't. We were able to pull the 2 campuses together, 2 programs together on a big Zoom call, and they just talked about their undergrad degrees. And they talked about maybe creating a 4+1 program, so you could do a 4+1 and mix and match, because we wanted to make sure we were being collaborative with our sister institution, and really wanted to make sure that we were understanding and appreciating what that institution was bringing to when they have students, and vice versa, because they have a graduate program as well. Next question is from Kurt. Due to great inflation and differences presented in public and private, the repeated statement not to use GRE cut scores and the example of rubrics using such wide range of GRE scores, what recommendations are there to effectively and objectively evaluate cognitive metrics? Kurt, would you unmute and talk a little bit about, and to not use the GRE cut scores? Could you unmute and kind of give me a little bit more about that question? Because that's a really good question.
Yeah, I was just looking at the rubric. It had like 1 point for a GRE quantitative from 150 all the way up to 170. Really, really wide ranges. And then you presenting with grade inflation and difference between public and private. How are we supposed to, or what are some examples or potential recommendations for objective cognitive assessment on these applicants?
Well, certainly, your only objective, in my opinion, your only objective measure is the GRE, because the GPA, you can't objectively say that a 3.5 at Georgia Tech is the same thing as a 3.5 at Emory, because they're 2 different institutions. Versus the GRE scores, you've got 2 test scores there. I really want to encourage folks to think about the range. I think a lot of times people think the range has to be small, and maybe on your rubric for your graduate programs, you have it's a score from not from 1 to 3, maybe it's 1 to 5, and that gives you a little more gradation, so you can make the areas between 1 to 5 smaller. But you really want to look at your graduate program and see what the range of scores are for the GRE to build that kind of component in the rubric, because that's really going to be the recommendation I'm going to give you in terms of evaluating that, is to stay away from the, take the GPA, take the GRE and create a cut score, which I know, especially for those programs that have high volume applicants, the clinical psychology is the one that comes to mind. They tend to have a lot of applicants for their graduate programs, and they're under a lot of pressure to get those applications processed in the best way possible. And understand that, but using that alternative approach, for example, or creating a rubric that looks at multiple things, multiple parts of the GRE, And then also finally having that recognition of the way they broke the score down to 3 components and valuing maybe 2 of the 3 components more than the other to really get that, to get at that evaluation that's going to matter most to your graduate program. Great question though.
I don't think we have any additional ones, John, but just real quick to circle back to Carl had a follow-up question as you were to go back to grade inflation for a moment. He said, yes, this would potentially bias grad programs towards applicants from private institutions. However, he noticed the inflationary trend itself was the same at both public and private. So I'm not sure if Carl wants to add to that or if you want to just address that, John.
No, I want to hear from Carl first before I address it. So Carl, if you want to unmute, talk more about that, please.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my question was, clearly there's going to be socioeconomic biases regarding students who have done undergraduates at private versus public institutions. And on average, graduates from the private institutions have higher GPAs, which would then more bias them into our graduate programs. But I guess what I was getting at is the inflationary trend you had from 1983 to present, a big upward trend, and the trend line is the same for both public and private. And meanwhile, I think some graduate programs have actually decreased, GPA floors for admission rather than increase them over time. So it seems like those 2 trend lines are going in opposite directions. Have you seen this?
Yeah.
So, I mean, what's the explanation for that? And secondarily, where does that leave us in terms of rigor in bringing in graduate students and education in general?
Well, a couple of things to think about. Number one is this. When you look at your applicant pools, have you gone back and looked at, let's say, a 3-year or 5-year study of undergrad GPA and who completed your program, for example? Again, using that kind of data to think about. I do think that I agree with you that if you look at private and publics, they're both going up about the same rate. So that's something to consider. I'm sure your graduate school has a minimum, which is not really, that's kind of like the floor. Usually it's 3.0, and many universities have you have to have a 3.0 to be considered for admission. If you don't have a below that, you can be admitted, but it's usually on some type of probationary period. So policy aside, one is go back and look at the data in the last 3 to 5 years and see, has there been any, looking at the students who finish, especially if you're talking about a PhD program, maybe you have to go back even farther, maybe 10 years, and really look and see, the GPA have a really strong influence. We're talking the difference between like a 3.4 versus a 3.7. And if it didn't have that big of an influence, then maybe look at it. It's 2.75 for full admission. Some programs have higher undergrad minimums. That's good to know. So what is that minimum? And then kind of build the rubric back from that, or look at it and say, okay, we've looked at 10 years of data for our graduate program, and we think that, our minimum should be 3, and we can do a range from 3 to 4 and 3 points of increment, because we know that undergrad GPA is important, but it's not important as maybe some of the other things that we value more, because we think that they're going to have a stronger influence on our students' ability to finish their degree.
Does anybody else have any other questions you want to add in the chat or unmute and ask John?
And again, these types of 3 or 5 or 10-year analysis can be done. They can get a little tricky sometimes, but you're all smart people. And if you have questions, shoot an email to Catherine, because I'm sure some other school has probably done this or is doing this now. And she may be able to say, oh, look, I'm working with this other school. They're doing the same thing. They're looking at the same issue, and go from there. And the other thing to think about it too is if you don't have one already, one of the practices I like to promote is what I call a doctoral program profile or a master's program profile that looks at the entering class. Here's the GPA, here's the GRE scores, here's some of those things that we look at, because it allows us to demonstrate, hey, if you're a student here coming in, this is what you can expect in terms of support or average GPA, time to degree. But also it's a good reminder for us as faculty to say, oh yeah, this is our program. This is some of the things we're doing in our program right now, to kind of keep that top of mind. Because if you're the chair, you're looking at that, or the director of grad studies, you might be looking at that, or the admissions committee looks at it for a little bit, but it gives everybody a chance to look at it and say, oh yeah, we got to remember this is part of who we are as a graduate program. The links that went too fast to write them down, absolutely. That's why we'll give you the PDF. That's why we'll give you the links. You'll have a copy of that, so you can go right in current and hit those links. And again, share them with your colleagues. Make sure that the information gets out so you can have good conversations.
I'll make sure everybody gets a copy.
Well, are there any further questions, comments, feedback to Dr. John Augusto or ETS? This is your chance. Well, if not, thank you, Dr. John Augusto, for your excellent presentation. Ms. Catherine Schultz, thank you again for your help. We have long-standing partnership with ETS, and I remain grateful to ETS for bringing together all of us on this important topic. WKU faculty, thank you for joining with us this afternoon. The graduate school at WKU is committed to the pursuit of excellence in graduate education. The GRADLEARN initiative is one such effort that brings national experts in graduate education to provide evidence-based practices to us, and in the process promote innovation at WKU. Thank you again. So long from the graduate school, and we will share the resources, the links, and a copy of the presentation soon. Thank you and bye.